I grew up in a neighborhood. I was sharing this with Kevin Cruz yesterday. My dad bought the house. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 4 years old. We were so excited. We moved into a house that was a mixed race neighborhood. By the time I was 5, there was only one white person left on the block, Miss Bucky on the corner.
Wow.
And those people were disgruntled. But joke's on them, because our neighborhood was bucolic, white picket fence. It was the most amazing neighborhood to grow up in.
Wow.
Every summer, hot peas and butter, kickball in the middle of the street. We would shut down the street, fish fries, the neighborhood, the block association. We had a block association.
Wow.
It was my childhood. Jacks, Uno when it rained, Monopoly and Clue in everybody's house. We would be maybe in Adrian's backyard to play Mother May I, and then we'd be in the Castro's backyard. I mean, it was community, the whole area.
Absolutely.
So,
what was the name of the neighborhood?
It was the presidential section of East Orange. Those of you, because at each street, I lived on Lafayette, and it was Grant, Sherman, Madison, Monroe, Roosevelt, Arlington was at the top, it was the presidential section of East Orange. And it was all Black growing up. Everybody was Black. Everybody, daddy was in the house, it was like, so when I heard all of these statistics going to high school or college, it was like, I didn't come with an inferiority complex because I didn't see any of that.
Good for you. Awesome. Yes.
So what's your story that led you to reclaiming your community?
Well, I think we should put it this way, because I think so that was an amazing, description of your childhood. But I think when a lot of people think about the community, especially Black folks, that we were born and raised in, in particular inner cities, the big G word comes up, which is gentrification. And that generally means outsiders coming in to change a community to suit their interests and ideas. And what reclaiming involves is first of all acknowledging that there was already talent and amazing folks there to begin with, and we're using that talent to improve the quality of life for our own community, and in particular, our own economic future. So, I'm from the South Bronx in New York City. And, and we were literally like the poster child for urban blight, still are, to be honest. And, but when I was coming up, it was it was the 70s, and there was the financial disinvestment, literally burning buildings. It was the era of the burning Bronx. And, like a lot of kids from communities like that, we were led to believe that if you want to be somebody, you grow up and you get out of those neighborhoods, period. You measure success by how far you get away. And so the reclaiming, of the title of my book, Reclaiming a Community You Don't Have to Move Out of Your Neighborhood to Live in a Better One, refers to our approach to community development, which is a talent retention strategy, acknowledging that there was already talent and all sorts of value in those communities before they change. And it's there to support us as long as we're willing and able to be a part of that transformation.
Always wondered, we've been talking a lot about Tulsa, Oklahoma after Watchmen, and then, quite recently, and, I have Demario Solomon Simmons on quite frequently, and we talk about what happened in 1921 to Tulsa, and then what happened to Rosewood, because John Singleton did that movie starring Ving Rhames and Esther Roll and Don Cheadle. But there were 19 thriving communities. North Carolina had probably one of the wealthiest bunch of neighborhoods. Mississippi's Mound Bayou, amazing. They ran a highway through there to destroy it. We understand how to build community. Absolutely. We understand how to make neighborhoods safe and viable. We know what needs to happen. These neighborhoods that we live in that are blighted, it's not because of the lack of understanding how to build great communities. So absolutely. How does that become the predominant narrative, as opposed to, every place we go, it ends up becoming a ghetto?
Right. Well, the long answer is, it's the legacy of white supremacy and redlining, and financial disinvestment that literally created like that wealth gap that we're experiencing. But the other piece is that we've been led to believe that there's no value in our community while we're there. and I think between the nonprofit industrial complex in particular, it's like there's this idea that growing up and getting out of a place like that's the Cinderella story that many people love. Like, it's like, oh, they grew up in a hard scrabble community and then they're going to grow up and be somebody. And it's like, why aren't we being somebody in our own community, considering the examples that you just gave? I mean, the fact that they're, back before when there was like legal, segregation, there was economic diversity, in those communities. So it wasn't uncommon for the daughter of a Black doctor, to meet, the daughter, of a Black janitor. And you realize, but there was an understanding that we could do all sorts of different things. But now I believe that there's really only two kinds of development, and it's like an unintended consequence of integration was that those that could afford to move did. Because there was always this kind of feeling that, especially because the layers and layers of poverty and how it's been criminalized, in this country, it's like even Black folks will like disassociate themselves from those that are considered, in that status. And so, but what we find now is that there's only two kinds of real estate development and what we call low status communities. And those are not there'd be that people, there's something wrong with people. It's more like inequality is assumed in some communities by both the people that live there, and also the folks that work to fix it. And so, and you see it in terms of the type of economic developments are there. It's like you see lots of very highly subsidized affordable housing. There's low educational attainment, higher rates of people being involved in the justice system. You'll see more liquor stores. Then you will see things like different diverse options for healthy food, stuff like that. So again, inequality is assumed, but the two types of real estate development, one, the gentrification that brings displacement, suddenly you're seeing, cute cafes and doggy daycares where they weren't before, and the other kind is what we call poverty level economic maintenance, where someone is benefiting off the poverty that lives in those communities. Whether it's all the healthcare facilities and the pharmacies that deal with, the lifestyle issues that do plague, low income communities, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, things like that. It's the very highly subsidized affordable housing and homeless shelters. Developers that build that, they get paid pretty well to make it happen. So, but the net effect is that people in those communities feel like, if they can afford to move out, they will. But somewhere in the middle of those two types of development, there's a third way, or that we consider a third way, which is a talent retention approach. And that's all about, we sort of borrowed it from the business community. It's like, you're a businesswoman. So it's like, you don't bring on people, to train them to do the job that's going to build, would build their profile as well. But, you want that they have to like do a job and you're not training them to go work for somebody else, right? We don't do that in our communities. Like there's, I think, and sort of not even unspoken, it is quite open that the talented ones in our communities are meant to leave and go and be somebody. And we're challenging that because we've never had a shortage of talented people emerging from our communities. We've had a problem with them staying because they leave for other lifestyle infrastructure that they like.
Yeah, but we can't blame them. Let's have an honest conversation today.
Yeah.
Majora. And I feel like this is a safe space to have it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to make people a little uncomfortable right now. 866-801-8255 and call up if you disagree. So I think about Nipsey Hussle, mm-hmm. who tried to come back to a neighborhood and bring industry, culture, community mm-hmm. into a space that was toxic, that was made toxic, because there are a couple of things at the same time. I think they make a place untenable so that I kind of have to leave. Mm-hmm. When Michelle Obama talks in becoming of, growing up on the South Side of Chicago, you're talking about the South Bronx. There's a level of danger that when you're successful, coming back in could put you in the crosshairs, because what they don't do to the gentrifiers, they will absolutely do to us. Meaning Black people inherently know we cannot harm white bodies in this country. So white people can move in with their lattes and they can run in our neighborhoods with their baby strollers. They don't really have to fear the drive-by shootouts and all that, because they know inherently if that were to happen, the whole entire, criminal justice arm will rain down on that community. But you could indiscriminately shoot Black people. Mm-hmm. Dwayne Wade's sister going to school with her child, there's not a whole, if that were Susie Q, Annie, some white woman with her child going to school, that neighborhood would be leveled and changed overnight. So how do we have this conversation? Because the truth of the matter is you treat a person, a human being, like a subhuman. Eventually they'll start to answer the call, much the way an baby elephant who's chained as a baby believes that the chain is still there even when they're several tons later and they could easily break free. They don't. So we get conditioned into a way of thinking. Right. And I just remember being a young person going into certain neighborhoods and shifting my behavior as a result. I got to be tougher. I got to be ready to fight, and I wish you would, and I turn into this person like, come, like, let's go. And that's not who I was. But you want to meet the heat. They want to make sure you leave there the way you came in. So you're going to create this environment. Can we talk about that, Majora, and how that impacts our decisions?
I love having that conversation because, it's real and it's deep. And, you're right. So people who feel socially excluded will do socially excluding things to others around them and to themselves, no doubt. And, this is, and I will never, ever say to someone like, don't leave your community, because, especially, if there is, a threat of violence. And I understand the people who've decided to not even make that, just not even just try. And they're like, we're out. But the bottom line is, I think to your point, in those, whatever communities gentrifiers are moving into, what's at the core of it all is real estate, right? And yes, white bodies are more, according to, our history, we do know one has more value than the other, at least in the eyes of some, right? But when we leave our communities, what we are essentially saying, someone else is going to come here and do something with it. And they do. And they do. And
so where's the happy? I still don't see a solution here because I
don't think that talent retention is going to solve gentrification. It's not going to solve violence, all of it. But what I do believe is that we can't really reclaim our communities without talent retention, without people actually deciding that it's going to remain their community, period.
So I've been thinking a lot about ways in which we can be intentional about the things we do, right? So politically right now, there's a lot of talk about, the gerrymandering and the voter suppression. And I'm like, let's do a great migration. Let's move to places where 1 million of us, say if we move to South Dakota, we could overtake a political system. I know, use South Dakota, but if I'm living in cold ass Chicago, and 1 million of us collectively decide to move into a place that we suss out, the way people immigrated into this country and came into, we got Chinatowns and places. We have I'm talking right now.
I thought you were talking about white people, because I was like, they had a whole host of entitlement programs before they.
Right. But, I mean, we could put pressure on the government to do. Listen, there are places that are blighted. And so why don't you have incentives the way they did in Tulsa? Actually, in Oklahoma, they had incentives. They gave the worst land to the Black people. And guess what? Oil was found on those horrible plots that they gave to the Black people for pennies. Oh, we discovered oil. And that's how Tulsa, Greenwood became very wealthy. But I'm just saying, like, we should be intentional. So say there's a family, 10 cousins, and they come together in the South Bronx. And they
Yep.
decide we're going to move. I have a cousin who owns, his family owns an entire block in Augusta, Georgia. And, so and it's beautiful when you go visit because the cousins live across the street from each other and they're raising their families there. And it's a community and it's safe.
Beautiful.
If we could like plan to, what are your thoughts on that, Majora?
I think, look, we should have plenty of tools, in the toolbox, for creating the kind of economic and social safe havens that we all need. The one that I'm looking at right now is the fact that there are also many people within communities where they are and, who don't necessarily, have, the access to go someplace. And so one of the things that we often see is that there are folks within communities like ours whose family do have assets here. But what we've seen, over, especially, over the past, I think 20, 30 years, as reurbanization, has made the kind of places where people of color were, destined to live in because of various zoning and other types of regulations and where the low income housing was, those areas are becoming more attractive. And what we're seeing is that, so when they were able to buy property cheaply, now predatory speculators are coming in and seeing that, suddenly those areas are more attractive for developers. And they're at a point where they can easily buy those properties off of the people that bought them for a song back in the day. And what we're seeing, because people don't necessarily know the value of the land, especially in reurbanized communities, they look around at what's there in front of them and go, wow, this sucker thinks that this land is worth something. I'll sell it. Like he's offering me a pretty penny. I'm out. Not understanding that piece of land is going to actually be worth a whole lot more. And I could say that in all seriousness, because that is exactly what happened to my family. I'm the youngest of 10. My dad bought our house 2 blocks away from the house I grew up in, which is where I'm sitting right now. And, for $40,000, something like that, he bought it in the 40s for $15,000. Had to pay cash for it because he wanted it in a racetrack, in California. He was a Pullman porter and because nobody was going to loan a big old black man money. So he had cash, carried it with him, bought the house for cash because he couldn't get a loan, right? My siblings didn't want to keep the family home because it was just like, oh, it's in the South Bronx. Like, it's cute what you do, Majora, but it ain't worth nothing. Now that house is worth 3 times more than it was sold for. Which was things we don't talk about for holidays.
At family reunions and Thanksgiving.
But those things happen, that was not a unique story. That happens all the time because we don't necessarily know the value of what we have, especially in reurbanized areas. And so that's why it's like we think of reclaiming your community is basically just being like, this is like our legacy to restore and repair our communities based on what's important to us. One of them is creating more ownership opportunities or retaining those ownership opportunities that are both in the business sense as well as in for residential, ownership opportunities. And just recognizing that the community doesn't get better, frankly, gentrification doesn't just start when you start seeing cute little cafes, where you didn't see them before. It starts when we don't value our own communities. That's literally when it starts. And that's what we want to challenge, that the idea that, we do have to always move out of our neighborhoods to live in a better one.
I remember driving, because I live in Jersey, where the taxes are ridiculous.
Yeah.
And there was this one block in Millburn, which is near, Short Hills, expensive. And every single house this is during the housing boom and then bust, went up for sale. I remember and I was like, I couldn't afford it because it was, but so many Black people were moving in. And as I was thinking, I was like, these white folk probably bought those houses for $200,000. They sold them for $1 million to, some Black stockbroker or lawyer who's now paying $30,000, $40,000 in taxes on top of that. Wow. And then the housing crisis happened. And I wonder how many Black folk lost those homes. But I was angry, actually, and insulted that Black people were making, again, white folk probably moving to Florida with $1 million, like they, like the guy from Monopoly, with the monocle, like they got away with something, and they did, So tell me, it's like the value where, the ice water is colder, but I don't think that. I think it's school system. I think it's safety. I think it's all of the things that you're buying, and then they move out, and then they run away with your money. We were talking about this yesterday. Black neighborhoods, white folks sold their homes for 3, 4, 5 times what they bought them for. They know that there's value. They sell them to us for that amount. Tell me your story, your personal story about buying the home near where you grew up.
Yeah, well, I didn't try to. I ended up squatting my first property because it was during the late 90s, and houses were going for next to nothing around here. And, the woman who lived there before, I was there, my family had been like taking care of the house for a long time. It was owned by a woman who passed away like 20 years before. But when I moved back to the neighborhood to start working in community development, asked my dad, like, well, who owns the house? And he was just like, nobody. And so I was like, well, I'm gonna be here for a while, and I can't be living in your house for long, so I'm gonna make it my own.
So you just moved into a house that, okay, go ahead, please tell the story.
It was the South Bronx in the late 90s. Nobody even thought about it. And so we tried to connect with the estate that never even bothered to execute the will. And literally from the time, we submitted an offer, and filed a claim in surrogate court to like make sure that it was all above board, my block literally ended up on the front page of the New York Times as like the South Bronx, the next next real estate frontier. And suddenly it was like a big thing. The family was like, no, we want full market value. We want way more than that. And then, but in the interim, it was crazy. A predatory speculator obtained a fraudulent deed and tried to evict me. I'd been living there at that point, or someone in my family had been living there for almost 20 years. And I was just like, no. And I had to go to court for 2 years to keep my house. And I did get it eventually, but it was a super, super hard thing. But I think that what the story shows is that, first of all, they weren't expecting me to fight. Like this predatory speculator was just like, we're just going to evict these people because that's what we do. And I was just like, and I wasn't trying to like build anything. Like I just needed a place to live. And I went through the process because I needed to make sure that I could stay. But what is clear about that particular process is that there are folks who fully take advantage, of the fact that there hasn't been like a dedicated push to support people in those communities to understand the value of their real estate. And that's why we sell early and cheap. In many cases, cheaper from what the house is actually worth, because we're led to believe there's no value in our communities. And that in and of itself, and you take systemic racism off the table, you take lack of access of capital off the table. What you often find are that people in our own communities don't see any reason why, if given an opportunity, why they should stay. And we had to give them some. And that's the talent retention strategy, building the same exact kind of things that make people want to leave the community so they can experience in their own community, so that they can then keep their example, their, frankly, their tax base, their economic dollars circulating through our own community, so that they leave their example in our communities that benefits us.